So, welcome everyone to the first session, to the conference, and dear participants, welcome to Belgrade. The topic of the first session is form space. I will introduce Professor Preston Scott Cohen, who will have the introductory presentation of the subject, and other participants in discussion. So, Professor Preston Scott Cohen, the fourth in line, but I guess that you all know, is the professor at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He's the principal of Preston Scott Cohen Incorporated of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Projects under construction or recently completed include the Datong City Library, the Tel Aviv Museum of Art Amir Building, the Taiyuan Museum of Art, and the K-Prep Theater in Brewster, Massachusetts. He's the author of numerous books and essays, including Contested Symmetry, Attenuated Architecture, Dexterous Architecture, Successive Architecture, and others. Cohen's work, which he gained many awards for, has been widely published and exhibited. Then Professor Jörg Gleiter, the first here, sitting on my left-hand side, is an architect and head of the chair of architectural theory at the Institute of Architecture of Technische Universität Berlin. He has worked as an architect and visiting professor in the USA, Italy, and Germany in various universities. In 2008, he founded the book series Architecture Denken. Among his books on architectural theory, philosophy, and aesthetics are Ornament Today, Digital, Material, Structural in 2012, Urgeschichte der Modern, Prehistory of Modernity, 2010, and the Philosophical Flaneur, Niche and Architecture in 2009. Then, sitting next to Professor Gleiter, Professor Sarah Whiting. Sarah Whiting has been Dean of the School of Architecture at Rice University since January 2010. Prior to Rice, Whiting taught at Princeton, Howard, IIT, the University of Kentucky, and the University of Florida. She co-founded WW with her partner Ron White in 1999. She has served as design partner for numerous projects, including the Golden House in Princeton and Drama Division renovation for the Juilliard School, New York. Whiting's writing and editing has been published in numerous magazines and anthologies from Annie to Wired. Currently, she is completing a manuscript on scale and urbanism called Superblock City, and she also edits a book series with Princeton University Press called Point. And the last participant, Emmanuel Petit, is associate professor in the School of Architecture at Yale University. He was a visiting associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design in 2011. Petit is an international correspondent for the Architectural Review in London. He is a partner in the firm Jean Petit Architects in Luxembourg City and co-founding partner with Ralitza Petit of Episteme Architects in New Haven. Petit is the author of numerous books, the latest being Irony or The Self-Critical Opacity of Postmodern Architecture in 2013. He curated exhibitions on Tigerman, James Stirling Legacy, and Peter Eisenman's Barefoot and White Hot Walls at the Vienna Museum for Applied Arts in 2004. He's an editor of Philip Johnson, The Constancy of Change, and the Schlepping Through Ambivalence, Writings on the American Architectural Condition in 2011. Currently, he is the editor of Reckoning with Colin Rowe, which is going to be out with Routledge London 2015. So I'm asking Professor Preston Scott Cohen to proceed with his introductory presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me here today at this conference. It's very wonderful to speak about Peter's work. When I spoke to him about this conference, he made a suggestion. He suggested that I compare his project to mine. And I think this has a great deal to do, of course, with the way he teaches through comparison or opposition. And he said that this would illuminate for him what his project is. But as I looked into it, I realized that it was more important to develop a discourse about the space form of his project by establishing a genealogy of which it is an integral part in and of itself. After all, and this has already been said today, among his greatest achievements and contributions to the discipline has been to do this with the most important of his predecessors, Alberti, Palladio, Scamozzi, Serlio, Terragni, Mies. And continuing in this vein today, I decided to focus my attention on the role of genealogy in his work vis-a-vis the architect who he has revisited most recently, and that is Le Corbusier. And would it be possible for me to have the slides? Oh. Now, what is most interesting about looking at Eisenman through Le Corbusier is that is to look at their work in terms of their attitude toward the city. I need not say, maybe, I don't know if this can be brought over here or I should move over there. Yeah, maybe so. Okay. I needn't say how important, how significant Corbusier's urban project is. In contrast, Eisenman is thought to be an architect who has no theory about the city. Even Peter himself has said as much. And yet, as soon will become evident, I think his work perhaps is the most radically urban-derived architecture of his generation. It turns out that we can discover Eisenman's theoretical position on the city relative to Corb's not by looking at Corb's urban proposals and theories, but rather by looking at his theoretical framework. This is really kind of hard to speak into. In looking at his theoretical framework for architecture, and more specifically by examining a problematic point among his 5 points of architecture, the fenêtre en longueur. For it is in this single point that we will find the cause for Corbusier's radical reconception of the city, which will ultimately lead us to an understanding of Eisenman's project. Architecture is constituted by paradigms, unauthored frameworks arising from developments that far exceed the will of any single architect. On the other hand, we have idioms, forms or stylistic elements peculiar to individual architects that either illuminate or transfigure the paradigm, as the 5 points intended to do, and to provide an idiomatic solution. The idiom is the 20th century's problem, you could say, and it is that which the architect works against or overcomes as they deal with the paradigm. The question for today is, what is the paradigm that Eisenman confronts? What paradigm is he giving expression to or working against? And what problem is he trying to overcome? The problem of the fenêtre en longueur provides a compelling means for investigating the answer. The first thing that must be said about it is that it is evidently arbitrary. It is just one way among the many possible ways to make a free facade. I would argue that it doesn't make sense that it was anointed one of the points. We can see here how so many other approaches could be taken. For example, at Stuttgart, where Corbusier stretches the ribbon all the way across, or makes it into a discrete opening, or on the lower left, glazes the entire free facade. Here he repeats the glazing. Here later again. There are many solutions to the free facade, an all-glass facade, as in Villa-Sava's interior. Now, this is in contrast, as I said, to the free facade, which is an integral part, is one among the 5 points paradigmatic. It was paradigmatic, clearly, of the very structure of architecture in his time. That is, architecture built from a steel frame or a concrete frame, all the facts of engineering and construction that are the cause and means of mass-produced space piled up. The paradigm of stacked space. These were what the 5 points articulated. But now let's compare the ribbon window with the rest of the points. Point 1, the pilotis raises the building with columns that continue vertically to support the slabs above, the top one of which, as we know, is the roof garden. Another point. That is conceptually the ground copied and raised above the building, reproducing the ground covered by it. And the most famous point, the free plan, a plan composed of points, the columns cut. These are the very same columns that make the pilotis and carry the roof garden, and in turn that free the facades. So we can see that all 4 points are paradigmatic except for the fenêtre en longueur, which is decidedly idiomatic. The 4 points, we could even go so far as to say, are not authored by Corbusier. They are description only of what he is confronted with, while the fenêtre en longueur is absolutely authored, his idiomatic move. And so why then should he anoint it that status, the status of a point? Is it a mere category error on his part? Is it polemical? A clue is provided by his harsh critique of the Germans' treatment of facades, of skyscraper facades. In 1921, just after Mises' Friedrichstrasse project was completed, the design that is, Corb said, "One fact condemns the lot. In a building, one lives floor by floor, horizontally, not vertically. The German palaces are just lift cages. The Louvre and Bon Marché shops are in horizontals, and they came urban through the fenêtre longueur." For Eisenman, the city becomes architecture by means of tilting, which we can see so explicitly here in Cincinnati. Or it becomes a means of gathering up the ground, as we can see in Santiago. Where have we seen a more powerful example of a building that gathers up the earth, moves it, as it were, than we see here in Santiago? The city is no longer, as you can see, a collection of buildings at all. Finally, to turn to Peter's request, which was somewhat irresistible, as a follow-up, as a kind of anecdotal conclusion to pay homage to him, I thought about this. I thought about what the Wexner Center's tilt may have meant. And it occurred to me that this tilt must have made an enormous impression on me when I saw it under construction in 1989. Shortly thereafterwards, I subjected a house to a tilt. And later, a museum's facade to a tilt. Another museum was tilting in another part of the world, and a house there too. And yet another project where this happened in New York, and in a library now under construction. The ribbon window, returning to it, though, is finally the place where I think we're brought most together and apart. For it was in Tel Aviv that we see that the ribbon window is tilted most explicitly. And there turns it into something other than what it was, no longer converging views to the horizon, but moving views deep into the interior, framing spaces one from the other. This, I would say, is a kind of project to tweak Le Corbusier's idiom, the idiom, that is, of the fenêtre en longueur. In that sense, I am working on the Corbusian paradigm still. But Eisenman's tilt is far more radical. He is not only a post-functionalist, but more profoundly post-Corbusian. Thank you.
I'd like to defer my time, Council, if I may.
Council.
To, later, I'm thinking about tilting, and all I can think of is tilting windmills. Is what comes to my mind, and whether tilting is in fact tilting windmills or is something else. But I'd like to defer until we hear other people speak.
Is there some who want to approach maybe Sarah?
Yeah, I think this is on. That's on, right? It might be muffled by wool. Let me just do this. That was beautiful, Scott. I have to say, that was really quite nice. What I'll do is respond by first making a couple comments on the topic of the object, as a way of getting into form and space, and then respond to Scott towards the end of this. And these aren't beautifully composed and prepared comments, unlike Scott's, so you'll have to bear with me. But I was taken with the topic, the form space topic to begin with, and with this, I would say a current, let's say, crisis of the object in contemporary discourse of architecture. And so I want to use that as a context to sort of get back into Scott's reply. So I'll start with two examples of where I think the object has been discarded in contemporary writings about architecture and why we have to be nervous about that. So one is Ricky Burdett, who in 2010 claimed that with the blurring of the boundaries among disciplines, you're recognizing that we as a field recognize that we don't solve the problem with an object building. Everything belongs to a context in the city. And then the second quote is from Michael Kimmelman, the critic of the New York Times, architecture critic of the New York Times, who explained why he is not talking about objects or talking about buildings. He explained it by saying, I spent 20 years as an art critic writing about sculpture and artists. I get it. To talk about a building as if it were a sculpture is a legitimate way of seeing it, but also an impoverishment of the various things that have gone into thinking about that building and to the life of the building and the people who use it. So there's a sort of current trend to claiming that any discussion of the object building is a way of a sort of irresponsibility vis-a-vis issues of interdisciplinarity and issues of use of the subject. Now, I find that this sort of crisis of the object is something that has come up in our field time and time again, and to me it resonates with Tafori's claim in his theories and history of architecture that the end of the object is tied to the eclipse of history. I would say today that the end of the object, or this discourse of the object, of its end, is tied to the eclipse of theory, and something that this room should be concerned about. In the current issue of Architect, the Journal of the American Institute of Architects, the editor, Ned Kramer, is very pleased to announce that the 3 issues of social relevance, sustainability, and building performance have supplanted theory in the hearts, minds, and rhetoric of our leading practitioners and academics. So essentially, we have a sense of that any discussion of the object, or I would extend that to any discussion of form, is being seen now as irresponsible. Now, Peter has long placed the discussion of the object or form at the center of his discourse, whether in his texts looking at how one can understand objects or divest objects of their traditional or associational meanings, and essentially shake us out of our complacency with understanding the architectural object. And I think that it's actually that interest in essentially shaking us out of our complacency that has always had made Peter as being interested not just in the object and form, but actually in our reading of it, as he said, what the architects see, which isn't there, so that the relationship between the subject and the object comes directly out of his interest in form. So all those who claim that Peter has no interest in the subject are disregarding the whole impact of his theory. So with that, I would come back to Scott's reading of Le Corbusier's Fenêtre en Longueur, and I think that for me, the essential allusion to say that that's a way of articulating an argument about the city is very interesting. I don't know if I would agree that it's a purely unified interior, but it's a sense of articulating a collective subject that's understanding the city from the Fenêtre en Longueur, so that there's a collective understanding of the city, and the transition of the subject of architecture being not just a singular subject, but a collective one. And I think that for me, where I would only have some question with your reading is the quick association of the total tabula rasa of the city in your reading of Le Corbusier's Urban, where the city is entirely wiped out. I actually think that the city is maintained but controlled in terms of, it wasn't a total tabula rasa, but it was a specific maintenance of hierarchies of the traditional city, combined with the new vision of Le Corbusier's city. And I think that same notion of understanding the readings of those hierarchies and the way to see what isn't there is part of Le Corbusier's vision of the city as it is in Peter's vision of architecture. So I would not let the city completely disappear or become the architectural object per se, but actually is a scaled up version of the readings of hierarchy and the readings of seeing what isn't there.
Should I respond?
Yes.
Well, no. I mean, what I think I'm suggesting, though, is that it may be that we can interpret, and this would be an unconscious intention, perhaps, or conscious on Peter's part, but because it's always both or neither, that he saw the evacuated condition as something that corresponded to his own preoccupation with the absence of architecture. What I'm arguing, though, in the case of Corbusier is that when you look at the plan in Paris, if you recognize these towers as affording this view of the landscape, the ideal situation, which he depicts from within, would be a situation in which we would not have buildings, but only the view to the horizon. The interior is represented that way in those sketches. So it's not so much that he would have built it that way, but that implicit in this architectural point is only that, as you isolate it, theoretically, the ribbon window. It is focused very exclusively on that particular understanding of the horizon. And that, I believe, is related very much to the kind of disappearance of architecture, potentially, that we could see, a kind of evacuated condition in Peter.
More than a disappearance of the city in Le Corbusier, you could say, by removing himself from the city by going up in the tower, you could say he's flattening the city, which is which he can't control, because in Corbusier the horizon is really the dimension of the precise of geometry ultimately, because that's where he derives the whole his whole geometrical metaphysics. There's the horizon, and then there's the vertical. You drop the apple, it falls vertically towards the horizon. So the horizon, you could say, is a metaphor for the precision. And therefore, by removing himself from the city, by going up into the tower, he flattens the city more than just making it disappear. The idea of the tilting that you introduced, I find highly interesting, and I want to just throw in two more names that I think would provide a link between Le Corbusier and possibly Peter. One is, of course, Colin Rowe, for the reason that Colin Rowe had a big problem with tilting. He with James Sterling's facades, when they started to be tilted, because once you tilt the facade, it becomes unreadable. Mm-hmm. So you could say that Rowe had a very big problem with the tilting and with the undermining of the readability of geometry. That is the consequence of tilting. And of course, that's one of the aspects that Peter would pick up and because it destroys the kind of present known conventional metaphysics of architecture. And the other name that I want to bring on the table as a link maybe, or as somebody else who used tilting as a way out of Corbusier is Virilio, and with Claude Perrin, who introduced the fonction oblique, the oblique function, which was all about tilting the conventions of architecture, which were the horizontal plane and the vertical wall. But of course, that is a tradition of thinking that Peter would never want to refer to, because in Perrin and Virilio, it is all about upsetting the body, putting the biological body on a tilted plane so that the body is out of equilibrium. And because the body is out of equilibrium, you force him or her into political action, ultimately. In their case, of course, it's a Marxist reading. So I just wanted to add these two names, Colin Rowe's problem with tilting, and Perrin and Virilio, who saw in tilting the way out of Corbusier as a kind of interface between Corbusier and what Peter is doing to the horizon.
I now have my wits somewhat about me. First of all, Emmanuel, Le Corbusier, Colin Rowe, La Tourette. He loved the tilted facade in La Tourette. So we have to be very careful about saying that Colin objected to the tilted facade, because he spent a whole essay talking about the tilted facade at La Tourette, number one. I want to also go back to Le Corbusier's famous drawing of the Parthenon, where he draws the vertical columns, he draws the sea, and he draws the mountains. And for me, that is the canonical drawing of Le Corbusier, because the mountains are the figural elements that Le Corbusier so required in the work. And it's, to me, tilting is the entry of the figure not literally, but conceptually, into the abstraction of the grid, which, for example, in the work of Hilbesheimer, Rowe objected to the fact that there were no fronts and backs, there were only lines, and that if you have a front and a back, you have the possibility of figure in between. And so I would argue that the tilt in my work, which then is later replaced in the later work at Santiago and other projects, becomes the figure, the sort of figure with the replacing the absence of poche from the classical notion of figuration. So to me, the tilting is a form of poche, basically. And just one footnote, Emmanuel, to the question of tilting in the subject. In our Columbus Convention Center, we tilted all of the wall grids, not the walls themselves, but the gridded structure on the walls 3 degrees as we tilted the plan 3 degrees off of the city plan. And prospective clients came into the convention center and were absolutely physically and mentally upset by the tilt. As a matter of fact, people became physically sick, and we had to change the 3 degree off-center to a vertical line, so that, in fact, there's not only the conceptual or political idea in the grid, the tilting, but also a truly physical one, as we found out. So I would like to think that we're not talking literally about tilting, we're talking about the introduction into the grid of the figure that Le Corbusier first drew in that drawing of the, which is not possible, by the way, since visiting the Parthenon this summer, you can't see the mountains and the sea in any way, shape, or form. And so that Le Corbusier invented this particular drawing to reestablish the figure in the work.
Thank you. Professor,
well, maybe I would like to point to one thing, that the horizon in the case of Le Corbusier is still a pictorial horizon. It's an icon, it's an image. And what is most important, I would also like to refer to the indexicality, which is this quality which then with Peter comes up with the tilt. So it turns from icon into the index, and this opens all the possibilities for the three-dimensional, for the blurring of the city and the object. I think this is most important to understand, that in Le Corbusier, the horizon is still a kind of rhetorical figure in the classical sense.
Thank you. Is there any other questions that you want to add to this discussion right now?
Well, I do think that the topic of form and space necessarily talks about the subject and talks about relations, because that's what ultimately your interest is in, destabilizing traditional relations and posing relations, whether physiological or whether disciplinary or whether purely in terms of the architectural object. And I would like to push further. I think that Emmanuel provoked an interesting topic with the introduction of Virilio and Parent, and how they were, through the oblique, introducing a politics. I do think that you also destabilize the subject through your work, and I think it would be interesting for all of us to push at where that allies or pushes at a political project, or where you see the possibilities of that, let's say, a collective response to the subject as opposed to purely the individual subject being destabilized.
Well, last night I was reading the proceedings from last year's conference where Jeff Kipnis was questioning the question of attention in the work. And what I would argue that all of us here, the four of us that have spoken so far, assume that architecture should demand attention. Kipnis questions, why should an architecture demand attention, especially in the political or social sense? And I would argue, as I did last year, that the only reason for architecture as opposed to building or utilitarian function is to, as painting, as literature, as music, demands attention to other than the functional, the narrative, the actual being of things. So does any social or cultural discourse frame itself in the question of attention. In other words, when you read, let's say, a book by William Faulkner or a book by Herman Melville, you're not reading just a narrative. You're forced to pay attention to the writing. When you're reading a painting or you're listening to a score in music, you're forced to pay attention not to the sound, but to the score. And I would argue that architecture of necessity, in terms of its autonomous nature, that is outside of our ability to perform as subjects within architecture, to use architecture, to be familiar with architecture, to use it iconically or symbolically, is this other dimension, the demand of attention. And of course, Scott draws attention to this in the sense that what he's saying is that to merely have a horizon line, to merely have vertical and horizontal buildings, to merely have a grid is functioning as a city or a building, but it doesn't necessarily demand attention. In fact, it draws attention away from itself to its what Ned Kramer would say are the conditions of architecture. So I would argue that what is underlying the four of us here, and perhaps all of us who are participating in this, and we should clarify this for everybody, is that the architecture that we're talking about, the critical autonomous nature of a cultural discipline, always demands attention beyond its necessary functions of narrative, of function, of subjectivity, whatever. And I think it's something that we should make sure that is understood among the four of us.
Let me ask something, Peter. It seems to me, though, in these projects, particularly the Wexner Center is sort of the key point, or actually the counter ratio. You turn our attention to the city. I mean, my argument that I wanted to bring to bear here is that if we were to theorize that from the point of view of the interior, the architecture must disappear in the Corbusian idiom, the finita longa is the idiomatic kind of expression, you are left with nothing but this flat ground, this buildingless city. Then should it be asking us to pay attention to that absence by paying attention instead to the city? I mean, do you accept that to some degree, that your attention, I mean, from that point on, the figure is made out of the city, not out of architecture in your work? You build the figure by cutting the earth, or by raising or tilting and manipulating the earth.
First of all,
or the grid.
I don't see today any difference between the object of architecture and the object of the urban. It depends on what scale you're looking at. You could argue, as Rietveld did and as Alberti did, the city is a large house, the house is a small city.
Right.
I consciously have attempted to be against that continuity, that notion that there is a homogeneity between the object and the city. So I would argue against the notion that you're putting forward, precisely because it leads to a smoothing out of space and time, which for me has always been the problematic since Alberti, because Alberti said that the parts relate to the whole. And ever since Alberti and Bramante, and that's why one has to go back to those people, ever since Alberti and Bramante, it has become necessary for every architect to fight in some way against that smoothing or homogeneous idea of space. So all of us that again sit here today are critics of not Le Corbusier, Peter Eisenman, etc., but of Alberti, because Alberti is the guy that set the paradigm of the notion of the parts relating to the whole. And every architect since then, modern, postmodern, whatever, has been about the displacement of that idea. And in fact, the people working in the digital, as we will hear probably from Mario Carpo later, the people working in the... Is it possible we could do that? It's very distracting.
Okay.
Thank you.
But I mean, I found it provocative when Scott was saying that you force the city to become architecture, which is different than saying that smoothing. What I don't...
Close to that, though.
No, because I think it
What's
is,
the difference?
it's,
You have to tell us.
well, that's, so where I don't agree with Scott is that it's not a city without buildings. And so...
Which isn't?
When you said that he forces the city to
Peters.
become architecture by making a city without buildings, which I don't...
Peters, you mean?
Peter,
Peters'
yeah,
work,
that you
yeah,
said
like
that-
in
you said
Santiago. I
that
don't
Peters-
see the Santiago as a building in the sense of buildings as we knew them before. Obviously, it's not. I mean, even in that photograph, you see the buildings beyond it, and Peters is not one of those. Let's go back. Okay. All right.
Oh, yeah, you've been blued out.
Okay. But anyway,
But I think that, so I think that if you see the object of architecture and the object of urbanism as being the same thing, then no, that's what you said.
Right.
you did.
You actually said.
That's
said
to try and disrupt the continuity between architecture and urbanism. That's precisely what I was just saying.
But in a way, Peter, what is so surprising then, if that was the goal, that you have a very strong, you go against the object as in architecture. And you could say that the city deals always with the very horizontal plane, and that the the domain of architecture is the domain of the object. But in a way, you have abandoned the object so that you can produce a ripple in the horizontality of the city.
Yes.
And so you do in fact, that is the Derridian problem of entering the metaphysical box in order to break it. So in order to negate the continuity between architecture and the city, you have to become almost like the building has to become like a city,
Exactly.
and then the ripple does it.
I would agree
And
that that's a possible reading of that.
The grid already in the houses prepared the way for this. I mean, actually, if you look at the grid of the Indian house, is it 6? It's not so very different than the grid inside of Wexner Center.
It's the same.
Yeah, and then the Wexner Center grid turns out to be indexically rescaling the grids that we know cities are made from, you see. So you may not call it smooth, but there is an analogy being built here between the city's grid and that of yours.
If you trace the idea of Pochet from Alberti through Bramante to merely Palladio to the Baroque to Santa Maria Capitelli, whatever, it is the attempt to overcome the smoothing of the grid by introducing the figure as an autonomous element that can never be assimilated to the gridiron. And I would argue that ever since Alberti said the part relates to the whole, the figure can never relate to the whole of the grid. And hence, every architect that I know, including the digital people, which is what I was about to say, are really an attempt to find an other form of figuration that has been, whether we call it object or not, the other form of figuration as a disturbance to the homogeneity of gridded space. And I would argue that that issue is in the first drawing Le Corbusier makes of the Parthenon, where the mountains become the figural importance.
But it's not the rhetorical figure that we were talking about before. I mean, I think what you've done, if I may put it slightly differently, is you've replaced the part to whole, you know, discourse with only a grid that scales to different indexes, I mean, in a way. And this now doesn't leave you any longer with this question of smoothing the part to the whole of the city to the building. Yet it does mean that everything is one in a new way. That is, everything becomes part of this grid matrix of scaling and operations upon the ground that is now, you know, oblique and so forth.
I think what Jörg introduces, which I would like him to elaborate on, because first of all, the idea of the figuration becoming indexical, number one, and then referring back to his article on ornamentation, which is something that, you know, there's a whole book that is part and parcel of the fact of the indexical possibility of ornamentation, I think is one of the cruxes of that discourse, as I read it. Yes. Not its rhetorical, but its indexical possibility. How would that differ from a critique of Alberti? In other words, I would argue why I was drawn to that particular text was that it was in line in the notion of removing the iconic and the rhetorical to the indexical. Was not an attempt to smooth the relationship, but an attempt to produce another dimension to the figural relationship.
Yes, actually this I had prepared for my little 10 minutes talk later for the indexical, because focusing especially on the indexical. Since this produces exactly this, the possibility for the disturbance or the blurring or the smoothing which we were talking about, and somehow getting things in a kind of a dialectical relationship without dissolving the difference between the two things. It is a very Nietzschean concept, and I see here the potential actually in the indexical, in the move from the iconic to the indexical, especially in this merging, in this new condition of of architecture, in this sense that it merges really the opposites into one, binding it into one unit and producing a kind of maybe third figure quality. Maybe this for the for the indexical, yeah, because I think we could really argue that Peter Eisenman's work is mainly, I think it's mainly based on one important term is the indexical, and I think this is one of the key issues even today in beyond the border of the digital. I think this is one of the key concepts which start to move to break or to smoothen somehow the opposites, the classical opposites in architecture.
But I think that both in the Wexner and in Santiago, there's still a danger of the reading becoming overwhelmed by rhetoric or icon over index with the replication of the armory in the Wexner and the replication of the landscape in Santiago. And so I think that you do have to push a little bit more that explanation to get beyond to respond actually to Scott's talking about Le Corbusier's using of the mountains as a literal figure in that sketch. How do you count on your reading subject not to fall into reading your figures as rhetorical, Peter?
Well, first of all, I can't because we fell into what I would consider the postmodern trap in the sense that as we were trying to break out of the grid for example, let's say in Canareggio. We fell into the trap at Wexner of the rhetorical use of the armory, right? Although no one reads it like that, we put forward the armory as the possibility of rhetorically reading it. The only saving grace in a certain way is the cut-off column, because that is, which then becomes an icon, by the way. It loses in its indexical quality and becomes also an icon. So the attempt to overcome the icon in architecture, the minute you enter figuration, whether tilting, cutting, or regenerating, let's say, will always have the danger of the rhetorical trap. In other words, there is also the trap of reading, when you read Proust, Return to Remembrance of Things Past, of reading the narrative. It's still very much present.
And therefore, I would disagree with Jörg when he says that the index is certainly one of the idioms of Peters, but I think that the thatness of the index is more important than the whatness of the index.
Exactly.
Meaning the index in Peters' work is so cryptic normally, with the attempt to get away from the figure, from narrative, from rhetoric, that it's the thatness of the index that matters. Meaning that you go into a space and you notice something isn't right, something is divided, something is split or bifurcated. That is more important than reading in Canareggio that, here is Le Corbusier point grid.
Or the armory.
Because you wouldn't get it anyways.
Well, he's working on, I mean, I think he's, Peter is inheriting a discourse of the found object, and given that it pre-exists, it's a pre-existing condition, whether it be his own, as I said, the traces that he brings to, the kind of indexical objects, which, by the way, were already pre-existing. They were the house, I don't know the name of it, 11, when he put them into the Canareggio. They're in a way pre-existing elements, as is Corbusier. You're absolutely correct, Emmanuel, that what we're reading with the armory is not the armory, not the postmodern rhetorical armory. We are reading the act of cutting and moving and displacing. All of those things are what we see. I don't think it looks like any other of the postmodern kind of constructions of that time, because no one had actually replicated so explicitly an object, first of all, treating it as found, and then, chopping it up that way. There is no other postmodern architect who did anything like that.
I agree with everything you say, except the condemnation of postmodernism, because I think there is a certain version of postmodernism that dealt with the figure. But for my part, Peter's space conception is very postmodern. It's the space of difference that matters here. The idea that everything, that the world is not harmonious, and that space is put in the service of a project that wants to make clear that what you see is not unified, is not harmonious, is not all right. The world is not just all right.
By the way,
that's postmodern to me. Very
I wasn't condemning postmodern. I was just observing that he didn't do it the way others did. I didn't say whether it was postmodern or not. I didn't mean to. I just meant that by treating the building as a found artifact, it's a very different treatment of the problem of differentiation, you could say, or of iconicity.
But it's a project of the avant-garde. It's not a project just of postmodernism.
That's right.
And I think Peter's interest in it is a project that predates the theorizing of postmodernism and reaches back to
All I want to say is that we have become used to calling certain people postmodern and not others. For me, there is an avant-garde within postmodernism, sure. And it's like saying modernism didn't have a rear guard and an avant-garde. It did, right. And postmodernism too.
And that would be Peter.
Well, he's certainly part of it, yes.
Yeah, although if we define postmodernism through the icon, so a strong focus on icons, on symbols, and its manipulation, then I would say Peter's work is not postmodern in this sense. In another sense, I just wanted to also respond to Emmanuel that, of course, the indexical is bound to the figure. We read the index through the figure. So it's not, there's no figure, but it's not icon anymore. I think this is the most important quality, that indexical movement is bound to the figure. They're bound together, you know, and that's the difference then from the icon and the figure, and the indexical transforms the icon into a figure, and the figurative, in order that the indexical becomes readable. So it's only, you know, the readability needs somehow the figure, so the indexicality that you read it, you need a figure. So this is about this dialectical binding those things together, which then for me makes the difference to classical postmodern approach to the visual, let's say.
Of course, at the Wexner Center, if you make that, if the index can operate through figures or through icons, the Wexner Center is very postmodern in the sense of the iconicity of the index, because you do see the tower and it's clear what tower it is, and it's broken, and that's terribly meaningful, you know, it's a ruin. But Peter moved away from that iconicity together with a bunch of other architects who moved away from the figural type of postmodernism into from the iconic type of postmodernism.
And we could even say he was already away before the Wexner. If you take, I don't know, the Guardiola House, or even the memorial for the murdered Jews in Berlin, you know, this is indexical. You know, the semantic is so totally suppressed by the indexical, which then opens up also a special quality. And I think this, I would also point out that the indexical is the precondition for the spatial qualities, and this makes the difference.
I mean, the memorial for the murdered Jews, I find extremely interesting for the reason that when the project started, and I remember with Inge, we worked on that, and the first thing Peter said was, well, we need to come up with a memorial that doesn't mean anything. And then the second sentence was what we felt the opposite. He said, give me millions of coffins burning in a big fire in the center. Those were very contradictory instructions, I felt. Either it means something or it doesn't mean anything. But paradoxically, of course, in the end, it is terribly meaningful and terribly non-iconic. There are no coffins burning in the fire, and that's the interesting thing about this project.
But I mean, to be fair about the memorial of the murdered Jews of Europe, already in the description is iconic. In other words, the idea of a memorial is already laden, as a house is already laden with certain values. This had very explicit values, and I would argue, where I agree with Jörg, and Ingeborg could say something more about it since she was an active participant, that it is the most indexical of all of our projects because we took an arbitrary ground surface that was figural. We took an arbitrary top surface, which was a different kind of figural, and we connected vertically through the pillars those two surfaces, reflecting the top surface and the bottom surface and nothing in between. In other words, the in-between were the indexical marks, which happened to be this objective concrete, which had no texture, no color, no nothing as far as we were concerned. So you could argue, and as most people in Berlin would argue, there's not enough symbolism. I mean, most Jews who visited say there's not enough description, there's not enough rhetoric, there's not enough Jewish feeling. I mean, you should hear the kinds of critiques still from the Jewish community in Berlin. So for me, it is the most indexical project that we did. And it's very hard to take the rhetoric and the representational and the iconic out of a project as we did in Berlin. And to my own surprise, one of my great critics, Richard Serra, who started on the project, called me one day after seeing, you'll enjoy this side note, after seeing the project, he called and said, "Peter, this is Richard." I said, "Yes, Richard." He said, "It's the greatest project you've ever done." And I said, "Thank you very much, Richard. Why is that?" "No plumbing." And so clearly, the fact that it came away from architecture toward what he was interested in made it a worthwhile project, but neither here nor there.
But the Indexical project can never fully escape a certain form of rhetorical or narrative project. And so it's, no, I think that's been challenged. I mean, that's been attempted at least to have a non-narrative prose. And so...
Like Joyce, you mean?
Like Joyce, like Perret. I mean, there are different figures who have looked at trying to look purely structurally at narrative. Why maintain the obsession with process or the need for the index? Is it possible to have a non-representational figuration that doesn't have to have a meaning beyond itself?
Well, that's a question. I mean, I don't know. First of all, is it possible after 50 years of working at something to say, why don't you try something else?
No, I just find it interesting that there's a narrative basis to many of the ways that you start out, even if you're trying to disassociate that narrative. And so that the role of the rhetorical is quite strong in your work. And I don't know if it's that in so trying to displace it, you need to bring it along.
I think your answer, Peter, to Sarah's question is, if I interpret the work, is that 2.5 dimensionality was your answer to the question of can you be abstract and meaningful at the same time? Because on the one hand, there's no doubt that you have always been interested in the 20th century history of abstraction, in Mondrian, in Van Doesburg, etc. But then you are not, you don't deal with flat canvases, but you deal with space. And now Colin Rowe, to bring Colin Rowe in again, he introduced the transparency concept that was so fruitful for you ultimately. You derived it from painting, from cubist painting, and that was flat. And you introduced half a dimension more, I would say, because if you look at your projects, there is a sense that the horizontal is your primary plane of operation. You give it thickness, you tilt it, you rupture it, etc. For me, the third dimension in your work has always been an open question until I propose that we are not dealing with 3-dimensional space, but with 2.5-dimensional space that is stuck somewhere between, I mean in the positive sense, somewhere between the meaning of the diagram, the flat painting diagram plane, and that is not 3-dimensional in the sense that it doesn't involve all the sensuousness of a space that is so seductive to the subject to the point where he or she forgets to think architecture.